I'd like to introduce our two speakers. I'll introduce Mike Clarke. Why don't you step up, Mike? Mike was Head of Life Sciences at La Trobe University. He's now an emeritus, and most of you know what an emeritus is. It means you just keep on working as hard as you've ever worked, but you don't get paid for it. If you're lucky, they give you an office. If you've got an office,
so share with Michael.
Mike has also been on the board of
Parks Victoria.
I was going to say Forestry, Parks Victoria, and also a bushfire expert witness after the bushfire, the recent bushfires, and many other things besides. He's also a grandfather, and on that note, I'll let you take over.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about something that's very dear to my heart tonight. Both of those two things are very dear to my heart, both my granddaughter and Major Mitchell's cockatoo. I hope you'll excuse me starting with really bad exegesis and quoting Jesus completely out of context, but he did say, look at the birds of the air, and that's what my granddaughter was doing last week. And just watching her do that...
What's he doing? No touching him, Mary. What's he doing? He's on your pram. He might fly away. We better say, we've got to keep going. See you later. Not too close, please. Alright, let's keep going. Major Mitchell, you might have to hop off now.
Unfortunately, that Major Mitchell cockatoo, or pink cockatoo as it's meant to be called these days, is not alone in being in decline. Last year it was listed as endangered in the country, which is quite staggering given its wide distribution. But a survey done 2 years ago of the world's birds reported that 48% of them are in decline. And that may sound a bit alarmist, but I do wonder, will there be any Major Mitchell cockatoos for my granddaughter to see when she reaches my age, if she's that fortunate? How are we going? What's the trajectory? We in Australia have terrible form when it comes to threatened species. We're the all-time winners of the who can drive out mammals from our country. We've got the longest list of extinctions of any nation. And again, we're leading the world in the wrong way. We're the first place on the planet to lose a mammal due to the effects of climate change. Yeah, okay, it's a rat, and not everyone's favourite creature on the planet, but it's a very special rat, and no one will ever see one again in the wild. It's gone for good. We're in the midst of what some have described as the 6th major extinction event on the planet. We've had 5 in the history of the world. The last one was 66 million years ago. This one is proceeding at a pace that the Earth has never seen before. Estimates by the Royal Society of London say it's something like 100 times faster than the planet has ever seen in terms of loss of species. Some creatures, and I have to get this fancy, just for those who don't know the science, the pointer doesn't work when you have a screen like this, so you get a really good, excellent St Paul's one. Some species worse off than others. The amphibians were the earliest to really take a dive. They're just disappearing at a really alarming rate, but the rest are crook too. My focus is birds, and so in the interest of full disclosure, I have to confess that I have a bias in this topic, in this extinction. I've been spending my life and my career trying to stop the extinction of these 4 birds in particular. So it may be a bit strange, but I'm going to ask you a question, just a simple show of hands, whether you think even trying to address this is a worthy goal. Just a general pulse, a few hands going up. Yep. Okay, that's sort of reassuring and puts me a bit at ease. But I want to explore tonight the why question. Why do we care if a species goes extinct? And I want to start off by trying to impress upon you why it's such a weird thing to care. If you're an evolutionary biologist like myself, this is not superficially what you would expect. Why do we care if a species goes extinct? why should our species care if another species disappears off the face of the planet? Yes, we're a species, we turned up about probably 300,000 years ago, and which is just a blink of an eye really geologically. Why do we care whether a species persists or not? And as I've just explained, this is the 6th extinction event we've witnessed on the planet. So extinction is the norm, not the exception. If we look at the fossil record, there's been a massive turnover of species on this planet. And if I'm an evolutionary biologist, perhaps I should draw comfort from that. But why do I care? If I look at trying to find evolutionary explanations, does caring for other animals convey any evolutionary advantage to me as an individual? Does it help me get my genes into the next generation? Well, I can categorically say the first hypothesis, that it's helped me attract mates or produce offspring, has been very limited. And if I did a survey of conservation biologists around the world, I think you'd find on average they had fewer offspring than the average person. So it's not a great way to swamp the gene pool with caring for other species' genes. And if I was to think about enhancing the survivorship of my progeny, I can think of a lot more lucrative professions than being a conservation biologist if I was interested in passing on resources to the next generation. So why do you care? Why do you care if a species goes extinct or not? And I'm going to depart from normal practice and give you a chance just briefly to talk to your neighbour. What are the reasons that you may have a whole list of them? Why do you care whether a species becomes extinct or not? And I'm going to collate a bit some of our ideas, but just for 2 seconds, talk to the person next door to you and say, why do you care? What's the justification? Whether we decide to act or not to act to address extinction crisis will come down to a multiplicity of reasons, I suspect, if we collated everybody's in this room. I want to introduce you to a model that I've found really helpful. I've been wrestling with this in a number of different contexts, as Chris outlined, in to do with bushfire and to do with threatened species. And I came across a paper by 3 North American women written 2 years ago, where they said if you're trying to understand how people make decisions about the environment, and that's this sort of decision space in the middle, there's external factors and there's internal factors, factors outside them, and then factors within what they're going to call their mental model. It revolves around 3 key features which I'm going to unpack: their worldview, the culture they live in, and what they regard as a trustworthy source of knowledge about nature, where they get their understanding. So I'm going to go through each of those things, because when I put the question that I put to you before, why do you care, to my scientific colleagues and to my students over the past 30 years, it's clear from their answers that their motivations came from somewhere other than science. Science provided the understanding of the magnitude of the extinction crisis for them, but if they were looking for reasons to justify why they cared, they had to look beyond science. And that's the area I want to explore tonight. So this model I found really helpful, and it starts with worldview. So by worldview, I'm talking about how people understand their relationships with other key things, other human beings, past and present and future, how they understand their relationship with non-human living things, and how they understand their relationship with the rest of the world. And you can learn a lot about a person's worldview in regard to nature by answering 4 pretty straightforward questions. Do they view humans as part of nature or separate from it? Do they think that non-human species have intrinsic value of their own, or only have value, instrumental or utilitarian value, as towards humans? And if you think they have intrinsic value, where does that come from, and who defines it? Do you think humans have any responsibility to act in the best interests of future generations of humans? And then do we have any accountability to anything else beyond ourselves, to a higher being, to a spirit, to ancestors, to a force beyond humanity? How you answer those 4 questions usually will unpack a fair bit about someone's worldview in regard to nature having got that worldview clear, then how they view nature is often goes through a cultural filter, where certain viewpoints, certain perceptions and social norms define what is desirable or undesirable in your culture. So I might know, as a biologist, that not mowing my lawns is the best thing I can do for biodiversity in my front yard, but because of peer group pressure, I will mow my front yard because I don't actually. If you come to my place, it looks more like the left. But anyway, the next example of a culture, I go forward with trepidation here, so just cut me slack. Some people regard these kind of creatures as incredibly companionable, attractive animals, and other people regard them as good eating. Completely different views of the same species from different cultural lenses. I apologise that I happen to coincide with certain pronouncements from a person overseas. But anyway, the point is well made that different cultures relate to animals in different ways. And that will be a lens. And then the third lens that filters through how we think about nature relates to what we regard as trustworthy sources of information about nature. So, do I only think about climate change as possibly a reality by having personal experience of some of the consequence? Do I have to experience it that way? Do I need to experience a flood or a bushfire as my basis for my understanding of nature? Or do I trust peer-reviewed scientific studies? Or do I lean heavily towards traditional knowledge handed down from my ancestors or from generations before me who have been on this piece of land for a long time? Or do I succumb to influential voices who might suggest to me that treating COVID is best done by swallowing bleach? There's all those possibilities of those differing sources of information, and which one we value will profoundly affect how we regard certain species on the planet, or whether we've got a problem to deal with at all. So those three lenses will greatly influence how we value one species over another. And I've been trying to write a paper very, very slowly, a review of the different reasons people come up with for valuing some species more than others. And I've come up with 11 so far, and I'm hoping they'll capture some of the conversations you had. If you've got one you want to add at the end, I'd be really interested to hear about it, but I think these are the common 11. Usually at the top of the list is the species is of value to us for food, medicine, food or fibre, or they're a threat. We devalue the species because it carries diseases to us, or it eats our crops, or it might damage our property. Some are really valuable because of the services they provide to us, like pollination or clean water, ecosystem services. Some have a pivotal role to play in just keeping the ecosystem running, like some of our top predators on top of pests. Conservation biologists sometimes value a species because it's so close to extinction, but we can do something about it, so its vulnerability raises or lowers its value to a conservation biologist. In many cases, we value species because they look nice, for the aesthetic reason, like a golden finch. They just look really lovely. Others are really one of a kind. This is a weird little bird called a plains wanderer. It lives in it's the only member of a whole family. And so if we lose plains wanderer, that's sort of like losing all the dogs, jackals, wolves. It belongs to one family. It's the only member of the family. So it's quite special. You've seen it? I've never seen one.
I saw a program on Landline.
Ah, yep.
About near Ivanhoe in New South Wales.
Yes.
They were doing something about
this strange little bird. Yep. And this is a Microthori grass wren. It's very rare, down to about 10 individuals, so that might raise our profile, or some people would say it's had the gong. Don't waste a cent on it. This one, noisy scrub bird, one of a kind, ancient lineage, goes back years and years in our evolutionary history. Some species, different nations put tremendous value to. So when Black Summer happened, I got lots of overseas phone calls from press saying, what are you doing with your koalas? As though the rest of the world owned our koalas and we should be caring for our koalas. So some animals trigger reactions for some spiritual reason or nationalistic reason. So it may be Bunjil for the Wurundjeri people who are initial occupants of this land. Some we value just because they look like us. And the converse of that, the less they look like us, the less we value them. So if you look like a snake, you're not as valuable to us as something that has forward-facing eyes and is a bit cute. So there's a whole bunch of reasons we might have, and I'm hoping some of you touched on some of those in your sharing. Important to appreciate that the vast majority of those reasons could be lumped together as what we'd call anthropocentric. They enhance our well-being as humans, and there's lots of research coming out now on the benefit of human contact with nature and the costs of losing contact with nature. That doesn't disqualify them as being really good reasons still for saving things, but we need to just appreciate the lens through which we're looking and putting value on species. I want to move past this though, because I want to explore where our science, how far our science can get us, and when we get into difficulty where our science is inadequate to deal with the challenges we face. And I want to put before you a hypothetical scenario and get your reactions. As a scientist, I can discover, or my colleagues can discover, all sorts of things about polar bears, probably the icon species for global warming. I can tell you what they eat, I can tell you how far they roam, I can tell you how many young they have, I can tell you what the projections are of the loss of the sea ice that might affect their effectiveness in hunting. And we know that in the region in which they live, Indigenous people have been hunting polar bears for millennia. Or in the Arctic, in the 5 nations around the Arctic Circle, people have been hunting polar bears. And in some countries that's been outlawed as polar bears numbers have declined. So of all countries, Russia has outlawed hunting polar bears, but Canada still allows it. Canada allows its Indigenous people to hunt polar bears. And it's strictly controlled, and there's a quota that are allowed to be shot each year. It aims to be sustainable, that no more than, at the moment I think it's around 3% are allowed to be shot per year. I'm interested. If I put before you the scenario that's not totally improbable that their population continues to decline, should sustainable hunting of polar bears be allowed? I'm just interested in a to put you on the spot, show of hands for the yeses and a show of hands for the noes and a show of hands for the uncertains. And who thinks they should be allowed, should continue? Those, one, yep, a few continuous, yep, not continue, a bit more of that, Ray, okay. And uncertains, yeah, a few uncertains too. Can I put you on the spot, one of the that they should be allowed, if you feel to say why they should?
I put up my hand only because the word sustainable is there.
Okay, you're assuming that we really know what we're doing, you're counting on the science, okay.
Yeah, I think the cultural aspects of permitting people to persevere in their culture probably also has flow-down effects in other areas as well.
Mm-hmm. For human health and well-being.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And spiritual well-being. Yeah. Yeah. Someone from the gnomes like to explain why we come to that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes. Part of the answer is to do with a living thing as complex and as interesting as a polar bear. That's one thing about it. I don't want that to be somehow
extinguished,
left out of the discussion.
Yeah.
And because that, I don't want it to disappear. And because, as I said to my friend here, the overall reason why it's disappearing is because of a toxic culture.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't want to give that. I don't want to give any kind of yes to that.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks, Steve. What about the uncertain folk? Is someone here? Yep.
I sometimes find sustainable as a weasel word, particularly in the context of development.
Yep.
And so if you have a declining population and the whole idea of defaunation, ecosystems start to fall apart, what does sustainable mean? We're begging the question at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of uncertainty around it for you.
Yep. Anybody else want to amplify? Deb, you?
Well, I'm not really uncertain, but I'm not either or. Because if there's an Indigenous culture who this is very important for, and there are, if they make that decision themselves, it will work. And if they're given the facts about the decline, they'll probably change what they're doing. But if they're told from above not to hunt, they'll be hunting.
Right, okay, so there's a whole bunch of sociology.
Yeah, so it's having they'll probably keep hunting. So it's having the ownership position with the group to whom they're most important culturally.
Right, okay. So I'm going to put a few more layers on this scenario, one more layer on this scenario. So in one of the provinces which it's still legal to shoot polar bears, the Indigenous people are allowed to sell a tag, a quota for an animal to a non-Indigenous person, a sportsman, to shoot a polar bear guided by them. At the moment, from what I can learn, they're worth about $25,000 a polar bear for the privilege of going out with dog sleds. They have to be in dog sleds, they can't use skidoos, and they have to be with Indigenous people, and they can get about $25,000 a polar bear within the quota, not on top of the quota, not in addition to, within the quota. And from what I can make out, a polar bear fleece, if that's the right pelt, is worth about $250,000 in China at the moment. So for an Indigenous community, should Indigenous people be allowed to sell the quota to shoot a polar bear? A few shaking heads, a few nodding heads. Would some of the the nodders think that's still okay? Has that changed any of the equation for you in any way that makes any difference? No?
Well,
It's still within the sustainable.
Still within sustainable.
We're not taking any more, it's just a different person pulling the trigger. That's all it's... Yep. As far as the polar bear population is concerned, it's immaterial who's pulling the trigger, it's a dead polar bear. That's...
And probably, if there's an industry to hunt, then the people who have got a stake in that industry are going to be conservation-minded. Just in the same way in Africa, you know, the tour guides who take people shooting buffaloes and elephants, they're part of the industry which is conserving.
Yep. Okay.
I think the history of the trophy hunters is pretty dire, you know, particularly in Africa. So I don't think any animal should become a trophy.
A trophy, yep, so that sits uneasily with some people for those sort of reasons. Yep.
But hasn't overall the number of polar bears gone down because of the intervention by humans with climate change? So why should we add another level? Why shouldn't we try and decrease another human intervention?
Okay, thank you. Yep, so we're getting a complexity of this issue. Yep.
Could you just repeat that answer? I couldn't quite hear it.
It's one of if we're putting pressures on this population due to, for example, global warming and loss of habitat or habitat destruction, why add another pressure, or why now allow another pressure to also persist on a population that might be declining?
And especially one that you designate with the word sport, right? It's still part of. I'm still running the toxic culture.
Okay, you're still okay.
It's also getting right away from the cultural argument that some people might accept because it's no longer a cultural thing.
It's an economic enterprise.
It's a trade, and it's also going out to shoot, but not using the traditional means of hunting by the herd.
Thanks I'm going to call it off there, and we can talk over at dinner across the road at Young Jackson's till the cows come home about this. I raise it because most of the conversation we've just had has very little to do with science. It'll come down to your personal values. The value you put, Stephen, on the living creature, the values you put on the welfare of the Indigenous people and their welfare and their community and the health and their spirituality. And so I guess in schools when Andrew and I are talking, we're trying to highlight that there are questions that science is unable to answer. Science can inform decisions to a degree, but then when deciding what's the best thing to do next or should this happen, we're going to have to look somewhere else for our values. Science won't give you that answer. Einstein realised this nearly over 100 years ago. He put it this way: I don't believe a moral philosophy can ever be founded on a scientific basis. Every attempt to reduce ethics to scientific formulas must fail. And I share that view myself. I have to look somewhere beyond science if I'm going to make those kind of decisions like we've just been chatting about. I can fill you with all the information I possibly can about polar bears, ecology, but at the end of the day, you're going to need to base your values on something other than science. Science tells us a lot about how the world is. It's meant to be agnostic as to how the world should be. So for me, I look at my faith, and for me there are fairly basic and I hope uncontroversial understandings of my faith that influence those kind of decisions. For me, we are a special part of nature, but not separate from it. The scriptures that I read tell me I'm made from just the same stuff as the rest of the universe, dust. And I think it's really regrettable when we, as Christians, have departed from that and regarded ourselves arrogantly as very, very special. We've done some terrible things to the planet and to the animals we live with. The second thing we seem to have lost sight of is that we think we own the joint. And Scripture's really clear about that. We don't. We're at best tenants or not owner-occupiers, and that the Creator loves the creation, and so should I. For some strange reason, caring for creation seems to be regarded by some in our faith community as an optional extra you do if you happen to have time. I think it was actually part of our original job description way back in Genesis, that caring for the planet was core to who we are. And like many faiths, not just Christianity, loving your neighbour as yourself, the golden rule, is core to my faith. And then I have to think, well, who is my neighbour? And when I think ecologically, as we had highlighted just up the front here, my neighbours are indeed the polar bears, my neighbours are indeed the Inuit people. What I do is going to affect them, whether I like it or not. How I live my life has ecological consequences way beyond where I live and how I live. And finally, this picture of my granddaughter Delcy reminds me of a very basic, the 8th commandment's pretty straightforward, don't steal. And I think the way we have treated the planet as expendable is effectively intergenerational theft. So we've taken something that we should be passing on and depriving the future. Will Mary be able to see a Major Mitchell cockatoo when she's 64? I don't know. I really hope so. I really hope so. For me, the challenge is whether as Christians, that's where I'm coming from, we're a people of hope and vision, or whether we're lethargic bystanders, sort of preoccupied with life after death. Are we really working with God to foster the Father's kingdom on earth, as Jesus told us to, or do we simply regard nature as some backdrop to a bigger spiritual drama that's of more importance? And I think Deb's going to help us understand a bit of that in her talk. So for me, we know what we need to do, and the challenges we face are moral rather than scientific. I think there's an opportunity for us to confess what we've got wrong and to roll up our sleeves and be better stewards of the incredible gift we've been given. So circling back to where I started, I'm dreading the day when my granddaughter asks me, so Poppy and Nanny, what did you do to address the extinction crisis? And so I've made my own practical list of the things that are possible for me. They're not game-changing. From what I can read, one of the most impactful things we can do as conservationists is lobby and support greater investment globally in the education of girls, particularly in third world countries. Developing countries, they seem to be the most vulnerable group suffering from the effects of climate change disasters, where families will actually sell daughters if crops fail in order to keep the family alive. The concept of that is just really hard to get your head around, and the impact of giving girls options other than reproduction is at the top of the list of one of the most impactful things we do. We need to be lobbying for us to care for what we've got now. Yes, we need to be cutting emissions, but we're also doing habitat loss at alarming rates that's having an even more dramatic impact. We need to, today's age is full of deer and feral deer running wild. We've got lots to do, and we need to get onto it. Thinking about more locally in my household, what do I eat? Where am I sourcing it? Am I eating a locally sourced diet that doesn't involve the loss of native vegetation? Am I transitioning towards less fossil fuel-based transportation? Am I minimising my air travel? And if I'm paying for carbon offsets, can I please try and find genuine ones? And I appreciate that's not straightforward. Think about how much energy we use. We're training our grandchildren to turn off the lights, which is a major challenge as they leave a room. Pretty basic, but it can start there. How do we use materials? I'm at a very fortunate stage of life where most of our money is invested in places and trying to work out whether the places we're investing in match my values. Whether I'm volunteering, have I got disposable time where I could do something? The final one, though, is one I want to try and emphasise, because I encounter with our students a lot of despondency, and I think it's really sad if our generation is conveying a lack of hope. I think we need to be rekindling optimism, and we, as people of faith, are meant to believe in a creator who doesn't have hopeless cases, and that's certainly what I'm clinging to. I'm going to finish with a quote. My colleague Andrew Bennett pointed this out to me. He's used it in classes for years. I think it's a cracker. It's from Jim Wallace, who was the founder of Sojourners, and I need to read it regularly to remain hopeful. Hope is not just a feeling or mood, but the very dynamic of history. It's the energy of transformation. It's the door from one reality to another. What seems impossible looking forward, like the abolition of slavery in the US, was inevitable with hindsight. Between the impossible and the inevitable, between the impossible and the possible, is a door. And that door is hope. The possibility of the transformation of history lies at that door. On one side of the door of hope is nonsense. On the other side of the door is the best news ever heard. Hope not believed is nonsense. Hope that is believed is transformation. Victories and transformation always seem impossible to begin with. They only become possible by stepping through the door of hope. To walk through the door of hope, you have to first see it and believe that there is something on the other side. It's never easy. It's always hard. This is particularly so for the first to walk through. Others then find it easier to follow, and that's how historical change takes place. Hope is believing in spite of the others and watching the others change. And I'll stop there, and I'll be handballing all the hard theological questions to Deb.
Deborah Storie is the senior pastor at East Doncaster Baptist Church, where I had the joy of preaching not too long ago. She started adult life as a veterinarian. Is that how you say it?
That's fine.
As a veterinary surgeon?
Veterinary surgeon, technically.
Okay, yep. Right, that. Yep. She's worked in mission work in parts of the world. Do I name parts of the world where you've worked?
Conflict-affected regions.
Conflict-affected regions. Right. It blows my mind the parts of the world you wandered around in conflict-affected regions, which I won't mention. And it's great to have you here. You're a theologian, and you're also, as a theologian, deeply thinking about these issues. It's great to have you here. And over to you. I think the pointer will work, and your first slide is up. Please welcome Deborah.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Mike. There you are. So I get to do the fun bit, I think, which is just asking these questions and thinking about them biblically or theologically. Why should we care? Why should we act? Mike's given you his list of whys for him and what he can do practically. So I'm going to start with some questions too. If you're looking for resources that will inspire us to care about species extinction and creation care more generally, what biblical resources do you have, and what theological or doctrinal resources do you have? And again, I'd invite you to talk to the person next to you just for 2 minutes and see what you come up with. What does the Bible teach you? What does the church teach you? And maybe I'll go to the second question too. You might also talk about obstacles. What are the biblical obstacles? What are the theological or doctrinal obstacles? We might come together and pick up those conversations again later. But I heard the end of Job mentioned by Jenny. Other things that were resources, biblically or doctrinally. Can anyone, what else did you say? Jenny, have you got a second one? No, end of Job. Yeah. Any other parts of the Bible to which you... Barb? Genesis, yeah? Psalms? Revelation?
Some various verses in Ephesians where Paul is talking about God's divine economy for the whole creation.
Yeah.
Unite everything in heaven and earth in Christ.
Yes.
And this is God's plan long hidden in God the Creator.
Wonderful. So through Christ, God has made us God's friends and given us the ministry of reconciliation through which he's reconciling all things to God's self. So that's Ephesians.
Yes.
Anything else?
Romans?
Creation groaning for the children of God to come into their own, realise who they are. Anything else? Leviticus. Tell us more about that, Mike.
It talks about land care. It's animistic. In that creation has agency and responsibility.
Yeah, land care and the agency of the land. You might also think of Sabbath laws which have the land itself gets rest and cries out when it doesn't. Anything else?
The Lord's Prayer.
The Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So what about obstacles? Did you have a chance to talk or think about them? Might be more doctrinally than biblically, but what stops Christians from caring about or acting out of care for creation? What means that some people think species extinction doesn't matter to God?
Subdue the earth. Subdue the earth.
Okay, from Genesis again. There's more to that, but subjugation and dominion are very strong words which have been used against creation. Anything else?
Idolatry.
And expand on that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in the Bible on idolatry, and it's not a good thing. And especially in two things. One is Psalm 115, where you become like what you worship. Right? So if you worship a false god, you will become false, and interpret all the business about the power that God gives us in a demonic or idolatrous form. Mm-hmm. The other one is that we're in a culture which makes the golden rule the top thing. That is, those who have the gold make the rules, and the rule is make more gold, and the consequences flow out.
Flow from that, yeah. So the worship of mammon, being Jonathan Cornford argues, is the defining characteristic of Australian society.
Yeah. Yes.
White Australian society since
white Australian society.
But Barb, you were going to say?
Yeah, salvation actually is just a sort of a spiritual thing, and it takes us out of the earth to another place, to heaven, and therefore we don't need to care.
Yeah. So the creation story, or the understanding of salvation is purely individual, personal and spiritual, and about getting out of here into heaven and avoiding hell in the process. Yeah. And so seeing salvation and forgiveness as only that. Yeah.
Summed up in a comment from one of our dear Christian friends who said, why has that naughty Uniting Church across the road got a sign up saying, act on climate change, should have a notice up saying Jesus saves? Like.
Thank you. And what would you respond to them? A Bible verse for them?
He actually knew that we were heavily involved in climate change.
Oh no, but if you wanted to, you might tell them the story of Nicodemus and Jesus, where at the end of that interaction, the narrator reflects back and says, the Son of God did not come into the world to condemn the world, but the world, the cosmos, the whole created order might be saved by him, which comes immediately after that famous verse. Yeah. For God so loved the world that he did not... Yeah, and they both, that's in that really famous story. So it's there. Jesus came to save the cosmos. So climate change matters. Any other, before I move on, any other thoughts about obstacles? I might mention one that I've heard elsewhere, And that it's a bit like the personal, individual, spiritual salvation story, but it's the doctrine that God's plan always comes true, and therefore everything that happens must be part of God's plan. So if species are becoming extinct, that's what God wants. Now, there's all kinds of other things wrong with that doctrine, but that's one of the consequences of it. And, God is sovereign and all of that. But if we read our scriptures, we know that many, many things that happen are not in line with what God wants to happen and not part of God's plan, if you see it that way.
Let's not leave out the effects of war.
War.
On the earth.
On the earth.
Yes. And on people.
Yeah, and you've got Christian complicity with different doctrines that actually promote war rather than seeking peace. Okay, so when I was talking to Mike last week, was it? Yeah. There was an idea that I'd talk about all the obstacles that we have, but I can't because we don't have enough time. So I thought we'd focus just on the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Because when we open our Bibles, the first page is a poem. A creation poem in which we're told a story, poetically, using figurative language. And if we get to the end of that poem, we're told these are the generations, or this is the genealogy of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So a genealogy in ancient times isn't about tracing DNA through ancestry.com. It's actually talking about relationships. And in this case, the relationship of the Creator with everything, of which we're a part, and we've got special responsibilities and special privileges, but it talks about our relationships, God's relationships with everything that exists. And this is where we come to an obstacle that we haven't mentioned, and that is when we're reading the Bible, if we don't take it seriously, because we take figurative language literally. So if we start reading Genesis as a timetable for how God created the world, or say that there's 7 literal days, or that this literally happened as if God had hands and put the stars in the firmament above, we completely miss the point. And if you're ever tempted to think it's a scientific account of the mechanics of creation, you just need to look at the second creation story, which begins, chapter 2, verse 4, these are the generations of the heavens and earth, finishes the first perspective and starts the second. So you've got 2 stories side by side. And the second story has a different chronology. In the first account, humankind are created, male and female, from that instant, after all the plants and the animals and everything else. In the second account, they're created earlier and they're not gendered until later. And so you've just got that little dissonance between the two, which shows you, this isn't meant to be taken literally, but it is meant to be taken really seriously. And if we take it as a 7-day scientific account of the world's creation, we're actually going to miss the really important truth that it communicates about human identity, about human purpose, and about the vision we have and our connectedness with everything. So the first thing that the poem emphasises, or not the first thing, but one of the many things, is that everything God creates is intrinsically good. Not just good, but very good. And this emphasis comes through repetition, and this tells us that from God's perspective, the whole created order is just fabulous. And if you're not quite sure, go to the end of the poem and you see God resting on the 7th day, delighting in everything that God has created. So the whole created order, including humans, is essentially intrinsically good. And from God's perspective, it's wonderful. Picking up on something that Mike said, we read this about the creation of human beings. Then God said, let us make humankind, Adam in Hebrew, in our image, according to our likeness. And a little later on, so God created the Adam in God's image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. God created them. So there's that unique thing about humans. We are created by God's image. Everything's created by God, but we are in God's image, and a lot of responsibility comes with that. But there's a hint in the word Adam, because that comes from the word Adamah, the earth, not the Eretz earth, not the whole created world, but the soil, the ground. And that becomes explicit when we go to the second creation story. Then the Lord God formed humankind, Adam, from the dust of the earth, the Adamah, and breathed the breath of life into their nostrils. And the Adam became a living being. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the Adam whom he had formed in the garden. And so there it's explicit that we are created of the earth, which means, if you think about it as vocabulary, Adam, Adamah, the Adamah is the earth, the soil, the ground, the stuff that things grow in. And we, Adam, could be translated of the earth, or an earthling, a groundling, a human being, or a child of earth. They're all other ways of creating it. A little later on, if you follow the Greek translation of the Hebrew, Adam becomes a name and is translated, phonetically transliterated as Adam. But to begin with, it's translated by the Greek Bible as anthropos, human. Going back to the first perspective, this is where some danger comes in. The Lord God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the cattle and all the wild animals of the earth and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created the Adam in God's image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. And this is difficult because it even goes on to the blessing. God said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living thing that moves on the earth." So we have the language of subjugation that you've already mentioned and the language of dominion, which sounds bad. What do we do with that? Because that is language that has been used against the created order, as if it was a divine mandate to destroy, to exploit, to do whatever you like with. But in context, what does it mean? Anyway, it has been, more dominion. So Lynn White, you may have heard of, I'm quite sure many of you have heard of, wrote this article published in the prestigious Science magazine in 1967, and he basically said the historical roots for the ecological crisis we were already experiencing lay at the feet of Christianity, and in particular Christian arrogance, and also that language in Genesis that we've just looked at. And some of the things he said, and I want to read these because they're actually, I believe, true in a sense, but it doesn't mean that we can blame Genesis for them. So, quoting, "Both our present science and our present technology are so tinctured with orthodox Christian arrogance towards nature that no solution for our ecological crisis can be expected from them alone. Since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. We must rethink and refeel our nature and destiny." And then, "We shall continue to have a worsening ecological crisis until we reject the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence save to serve man." His language, not mine. So I would first argue with him and say, well, actually, it might have been taught as a Christian axiom, but it's wrong. That's not the only purpose of nature, of creation or nature. But what did you think of that earlier part of the quote? Christian arrogance towards nature does have a lot to answer for. And as Mike suggested, where the roots of our trouble are religious in our worldview, how we've treated the world, the remedy must essentially be religious, whether we call it or not. We need to rethink and refeel our nature and destiny, which to me means rethinking and feeling our identity our vocation, our vision, our purpose, which I think we do need to do because we need to get back to what Genesis really teaches us about that, not to go with the idea that this subjugation and dominion language is a warrant to despoil and destroy. So, going back, when you read this subjugation and dominion language, which is very strong and even harsh language in context, it is qualified in all kinds of ways. You know, that old saying, a text without a context is a pretext. Well, everything you need to modulate that term is already there in the Genesis poem, and particularly when you bring the second creation account together with it. So, in God's blessing of the people, the humankind, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, echoes the blessing already given to all of the sea creatures and all of the air creatures on the earth, the birds and the fish and all the other monsters and everything that lives there. They have already been blessed and told to be fruitful and multiply and fill their environment, which means that any flourishing and multiplying and filling humans should do should not contradict that earlier blessing. It should enable it. If I can be allowed a slight digression, some time ago I was reviewing a project here. Australia was assisting in Kampala, the capital city of Uganda, and there was a grandparents association meeting in the evening. They were people who had settled in the slums, in the flood parts of the city, because they'd been squeezed off their ancestral land, usually for development projects, which made things that rich people want, or holiday places for tourists, that type. They were squeezed into the city. And they were talking about their responsibilities as grandparents. And one man, I could tell he was a Muslim because of the cap he wore. So they were Muslim, Christians, animists all together in the same group. And he said, well, when God created the earth, he told us to go and multiply and fill the earth, but he also told us to care for it, to preserve it. We have done the first bit of that command really well, too well. We have more than filled the world. We've got to stop having so many children, but we've forgotten completely about caring and preserving the good earth that God made. And so it's keeping the two together in balance. And he said, we've done that fill bit, now it's time to stop making so many babies. He wasn't saying make none, but do we really need, in their case, 12 children, or should we be having fewer? Most of the grandparents advocated 4 children per family because of the needs of living in that place. So that's one of the nuances that comes. The blessing to the other animals limits the fulfilling of, or the multiplying aspect of humankind. There's also, when it goes on and God says, see, I've given you all of this, and you'll have all of these plants, all the seed-bearing plants and the seed-bearing trees, you'll have them for food. But look, to the beasts of the earth and the birds of the air and everything that creeps on the earth, everything with the breath of life, God has given all of the green plants for food. And so food provided for both. Human food should not come at the expense of the food of other natural creatures. And so in Mike's list of things to do, it was eat locally, but don't cause habitat loss by what we eat. Thinking about those things a limit. And this is a second creation account. I've just taken out bits that are particularly relevant to this. I've skipped through verses, but you'll have to put it all together yourself. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, and there was no Adam to serve the Adamah. There was no Adam to serve the earth, no earthling to serve the earth. Then the Lord God formed humankind, Adam, from the dust of the earth, and breathed the breath of life into their nostrils, and that Adam became a living being. And God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the Adam whom he had formed. A bit later on, God took the Adam and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. And that's our vocation. Tilling and keeping the earth, which could be translated, Ellen Davis translated this way, to serve and preserve. That's our role, serving and preserving the earth, right there in Genesis. So any dominion, any subjugation comes with that command to serve. There are also limits on domination written right into the creation account. With perspective 2, humankind or perspective 1 actually, I'm going back, but this is perspective 2, but we're created in God's image. So any dominion we exert should reflect God's dominion. That Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So we should be exerting our dominion in a way that reflects God's dominion, God's rule, that does God's will. In perspective 1, it tells us that actually the whole process is spiritual, because in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth, the spirit or the wind or the breath of God, Ruach Elohim in Hebrew and Pneuma Theou in Greek, was sweeping over the face of the earth. The spirit right there in the beginning, and then we have the breath of life, breathed, different language. It's not the same Pneuma language there in Greek, but different language, making the Adam a living being. The limit, as I think I've got my... Oh, yeah, sorry, going back one. That limit is the limit of Sabbath, the day of rest, not just for humans, but for all people together and all animals and even the earth. And it's a moment to pause and remember that the earth belongs to God, that not to us. You read on through the law and the prophets, and it's a day where you must specifically not even think about making profit. It's a day to delight in creation and remember our relationships and remember our God. And it's a great tragedy that we no longer have a Sabbath in our country and many others. I'd love for it to come back, not only for creation care purposes, but so that the people who are in lower paid jobs can actually have a day off together with their whole families, which so few people can do now. Another limit written into the story is in the third creation story about that tree and the fruit that was not to be eaten from the one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's symbolic, again, this is not about an apple or an orange or whatever type of fruit it was. It's about observing God-ordained limits. There are all kinds of limits in creation that we need to observe, and just because we can transgress them doesn't mean that we should. And so this is a symbolic action that has terrible consequences. It's a temptation. The snake is there, and the snake says no harm will come. But harm does come, and not just for the two earthlings, but for the whole created earth order. It becomes unbalanced, disrupted, damaged in different ways. So, in summary, our human rule or dominion or lordship is intended to reflect God's loving rule. We're created in God's image. It should honour our earth family relationships. We are created of the earth. We're part of creation, not apart from it. It should respect God-given limits. Remember the Sabbath day and the tree with the fruit that should not be eaten. And it should enable the more than human world to flourish, to serve and preserve the earth, and to enable the birds and the fish and everything else to multiply and to preserve their food and their habitat. A brief step into the New Testament, since Mike began his talk by looking at the birds. Part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' most extended body of teaching in Matthew's Gospel. And I just wanted to draw your attention to a few things in this sermon. First, Jesus' preferred way of referring to himself, Son of Man, usually translated, but in Greek, hochouios tou anthropou, the son of the earthlings, the son of humanity. And if you translate that back to Hebrew, you get Ben Adam, the son of earth. And so you can see this beautiful tension, or not really tension, but the linkage between the Son of God and the Son of earth. Just as we are made in the image of God and made in the earth, Jesus calls himself the Son of earth, and we know that Jesus is the Son of earth. In this sermon, when Jesus talks about looking at the birds, considering the lilies, it's a section about not worrying about anything and seeing clearly, not seeing with an evil eye or distorted vision. And when we see clearly, we remember that we are who God made us, or as Jesus said in this sermon, you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. In a way, the whole sermon is about being who we are. And looking at the birds, considering the lilies, helps us be true to our identity, our calling and our purpose, which is where I will end.
That is the most insightful look at those couple of chapters of Genesis that I've ever heard. Thank you so much, Deb. That was great. I hope I speak for everyone. And what a great compliment to what Mike had to say. A brief comment or ask a question, or if you want to engage with each other, feel free to do that too. Yes, Mark.
So it seems a lot of the problems we're facing is that humanity has overshot its mandate to have authority over the earth, and we've erred into exploitation and subduing the world. So what corrective can we as Christians kind of speak into our contemporary culture about asking humanity to be more humble in their authority? Do we have any religious arguments that will carry weight?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a really good answer, Deb, so if you've got one earlier, that's great. For me, scientifically, I'd try and emphasise, and that's probably not Christianly, but scientifically as a Christian, to approach that really transparently of what we don't know, to challenge the bubble that we're in charge and we've got this all sorted out and science has the answers to all the questions worth asking. So I think as a scientist, being really frank about the limitations of my profession is helpful in this debate. So we sort of pull back the scientism that, you know, we'll engineer our way out of this, it'll be okay, without having to make any changes in our values. So that's where I come from as a scientist who happens to be a Christian, and I'm motivated to challenge my science and to highlight its limits because of my faith, and trying to do my science in a more humble manner rather than saying we've got the answers, which I think our society would love us to say, surely those clever scientists will sort this out, we won't have to change how we live.
Yeah, I think, Mike, there's no soundbite answer to that. I think I'll quote one of my favourite missiologists, Leslie Newbegin, who said the most effective witness to the gospel is a Christian community who live as if they believe it. And so if we get Christians who start to walk more lightly on the earth and stop worshipping mammon or convenience or security or the idols that we have, and a community of Christians can actually show that it's possible to live well and live simply in a way that doesn't trash the earth. So things like taking public transport or making sure that you divest of any investments that are doing radical damage. Along with that, when we're talking in a Christian context, it's been really, really clear that God loves the world, not just us. That this spiritual material divide isn't biblical. It's been imposed on it, and that all of material life really matters. And if you read the creation story, everything that happens is spiritual. The Spirit of God is there the whole way, and what we do with the planet is a spiritual question. So being clear about that, and being clear about our identity, image of God, of the earth, our vocation to serve and preserve, to exercise rule. In Greek it's the archawut, where you get archbishop and other Anglican hierarchical words from. But in Hebrew it's another really strong word that is modulated by our caring and serving and preserving the earth and not destroying things for future directions. It also comes back, New Testament again, love of God and neighbour. The greatest commandments, we can't, as Pope Francis keeps reminding us, love our neighbours, local, global, future if we trash our common home. This is where we live. We need to look after it. For the species, yes, but also for our own species.
You mentioned that we're in the middle of we're at the point of a kind of an extinction crisis. Is it too late? I mean, are we kind of, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic? I mean, from a scientific point of view, I certainly get the fact that we need to act individually and do our best, but is it already too late?
No, I don't. It's too late for some things, for sure. But I like, and the analogy that helps for me is you've got a very fully laden semi-trailer bearing towards a brick wall crash. If we can slow the impact of that collision, there's going to be more survivors. So the crash is going to happen, but we have, I think, some tools at our disposal to determine the speed of the semi-trailer, and the slower we can make it, the more chance nature has of hanging in there. So, and yeah, I guess from my faith, I don't believe there's hopeless cases, and perhaps I'm delusional. Perhaps I'm delusional, but I'd rather cling to hope.
What about the perspective of a history of populations, so early populations? Nature seemed bountiful, and even the history of the Europeans coming over here and chopping all the trees down in Victoria for resources. But then, all of a sudden we've gone from, 1 million in the world to sort of 9 billion or whatever it is. When was the consciousness of sort of, change, perhaps from going from exploitive to suddenly realising that we do have control, or our effect on the earth is substantial?
For me, it comes down to that where we get our source of knowledge from, and different people interpret the future depending on what they regard as their trustworthy sources of knowledge. So it's going to be embraced at different paces in different parts of the world. I was really interested in Deb's story of the conversation of the grandparents. They're embracing a new story.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, I left out the first thing that man said when God created the earth was empty, it needed people to care for it. That was the we need to multiply, we don't now. But for me, like empirically, the poor masses of Africa do not nearly the damage that the few wealthy do.
That's,
so
enormously
it's not
important.
just having fewer children, it's actually learning to walk lightly. Those of us who have the money and power to do a lot of damage need to actually choose not to. And this is where the stories we tell become really important. When I was doing my PhD research, I did a lot of work in study into public psychology about how human behaviour is shaped, and learned that only about 8% of people decide what to do on a rational decision-making basis, whereas most of our behaviours that are creation-preserving or creation-destruction are just matters of habit that we never even think about. And so that Sabbath day gives us a chance to think and look and see and decide, well, are we living in a way that actually preserves the earth, or are there things we need to do differently? And getting beyond conscious decisions to creating a culture where we're not always pushed to do the most ecologically damaging thing because that's what increases the GDP and makes money, but actually choose to do other things that usually don't turn anyone a buck, but they're very good for our well-being and they're good for the planet as well.
This is not so much an extinction question, but Deb, I was really taken, as Chris said, by your exposition of Genesis. Can I ask you therefore, how do you interpret where it's saying God said, let us make Adam in our image and our likeness? How do you interpret that?
Well, I interpret it just as that we are created in God's likeness, which is also, it's both a fact, every human being bears the image of God, but it's also a call, an invitation to live and become more godlike. So we might talk about imitating Christ, but we should also be imitating God and trying to live in a way that reflects God's goodness and grace, but with humility, because we absolutely are not God. And even when we intend well, we might not do well. So it's holding both the frailty and the limitedness of ourselves together with the, well, there's something of the image of God in us and in everyone.
Now, what do you mean by the image of God?
Well, we, in some way, it's a mystery, we reflect something of God's nature.
You mean a spiritual?
I don't separate spiritual and material. I think it's all kind of together. I'm not saying God has a physical body, but because God's beyond all of this, you know, God invented time, which is another reason why it doesn't make sense to say 7 days exactly creation finished. But yeah, there's something mysterious there that I can't put my finger on. But if I can quote Jonathan Sacks, some of you might have known him, he's deceased now, but for a while he was the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth. He wrote some wonderful books, including one called The Dignity of Difference. And he talked about this creation story, saying the radical thing about God saying, let us make Adam in our likeness, was not that a human being could be the image of God, because the Sumerian kings and the pharaohs of Egypt and the Roman Caesars and others, they all said that the king was either a god or a reflection or ambassador of God. But Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we all say that every single human being is made in God's image, which means that if any human being is sacred, they all are. And that's radical. And I'd also say, and because God created the whole, everything is sacred. We don't have sacredness alone, but we do have something special about the image of God in us, which also goes to our ability to do huge damage. If we don't modulate that rule, that power, that dominion, we can destroy the earth. So it's that responsibility edge.
Deb, Genesis is termed in the past sense often, God created, and I understand that God is still creator, and so God is still creating, and past extinction events have happened, right? And the Creator is active in bringing forth new life out of those devastating times. So, I don't know whether I haven't got a question really,
it's interesting. So the verb to create is a very, Bart might want to jump in here, but it's a very distinctive verb that isn't used to people, except with a few exceptions, but it is nearly always of God. It's about creating out of nothing, in a sense. And God creates. We are creative, but we don't create in the same way. But if we go, we study Genesis, we go to Revelation, and the one on the throne says, behold, I make all things new. It doesn't actually say, behold, I make new things, because it's not that Earth's going to be burnt and destroyed like I was taught as a child, but we're part of that renewing. And that ambassadors for Christ from 2 Corinthians that Stephen mentioned, it's God's calling us to be part of the creative process. Not that we are the creator, but we're part of that process. And in the Gospel of John, it's a new creation story. At the end, Jesus breathes on the disciples and receive the holy breath, just like the creation of the Adam in the beginning. Yes. The beginning of John, of course, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and all things were created through the Word. So you've got that new creation coming, but it's not going to be a brand new earth, it's going to be a renewed, restored earth. And that Revelation vision 2 is the holy city coming to earth, the tree with the leaves of healing for the nations. It's just beautiful. Figurative, poetic, metaphorical, yes. Take it seriously, not literally.
Yes.
Yeah.
We might finish there.
Can I recommend Chris's book, because he won't do it highly enough, The Christian Science and Christianity. If you have teenagers who are exploring things, it's a cracker. It's the book I really wish was written when I was young.
I want to recommend another Issachar's book, John Thompson's book on Genesis 1 to 3.
Yeah, I think
what it's called.
That's right. It's called Genesis 1 to 3. It's great. It's also available for free on our website as a PDF. Yeah. Thank you, Mike. Thank you all for coming.